Well, welcome everyone to our first Ashbrook Scholar webinar of the year. This webinar is on the Declaration of Independence. Ben, do you want to say anything about the purpose of these before we start, since this is the first one, or should we just?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've got a number of purposes here. I mean, obviously, first and foremost, we want to just help you guys work through the material and learn a little more about the history of our great nation. But also want to give you guys a sample of the kind of education we provide here at Ashbrook for students who are interested in it. So we do have an undergraduate program here for students majoring in political science and history. And once you guys are all ready for college choices, we'd all like to think you might give us a chance. All of our classes are taught in the method that Dr. Burkett and Dr. Stevens are going to use tonight, very conversational. And we use primary sources in everything we do. We don't really deal with textbooks a lot. So we think that's a good method for learning about these things. And we'll hope to give you a taste of how we do things tonight. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Stevens and Dr. Burkett and have a good conversation, guys.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Ben.
We've got quite a few people joining us this evening, which is great. Let me, if you don't mind, before we turn to the document, as Ben said, in everything that we do, we start with reading original documents, and then from there we have really good conversations about the ideas in those documents. It's a little harder to do online than it is in a classroom, but I want you all to feel comfortable jumping in with questions or comments or observations when those come up. In our classes, by the way, in our actual physical classrooms, in our college courses, we don't tolerate hand raising, so we encourage students to jump into the conversation at the right time, using their best judgment about when to jump in. So feel free to jump in if you have thoughts or questions or observations. Feel comfortable. You can, if you really want, since it's online, use the hand raising thing here. And if I do see your hand go up on the online, whatever this is called, I'll just give you a shout out and you can jump in. But don't feel like you have to raise your hand. Feel free to jump into the conversation whenever it strikes you that it's appropriate to do so. So my name's Chris Burkett. I teach political science and history here at Ashland University, and I'm with Jason Stevens. Jason's also teaches political science and history here. He's a colleague of mine, and an Ashbrook Scholar as an undergraduate. So we're between the two of us, we'll start start a discussion or facilitate a discussion about the Declaration. But again, we'd like for all of you to jump in when you feel it's appropriate to do so. One of the things we frequently do, since we start with original documents, one of the things we frequently do in our classes is we just start reading. We read out loud in class quite a bit because it helps us all to hear the words that are written and perhaps let the ideas in those words sink in a little bit. So anybody want to read? I know this is our first webinar. Anybody want to take a shot at reading the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence? Anybody brave enough to do this on their first webinar?
So I can read.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Hey, good to see you. Actually, I don't see you yet. I hear you.
I'm just not going to turn on my camera. If that's okay.
Okay, go right ahead. You want to read, please?
So, in Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13th United States of America. So, how long should I read? I should read until...
We'll tell you when to stop.
Okay. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Good, very good. Got every word just right. So, what do you notice about that opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence? Anybody? What jumps out at you? What do you notice? What strikes you as interesting?
When they say it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that connected them with another, they're declaring that they are going to separate from Britain.
Okay, and why? In that sense, according to that sentence, why are they dissolving the political bands which have connected them with another people, according to the Declaration? What's the reason in that sentence or in that clause that they claim they're separating?
They say it is to assume the powers of the
Well,
earth.
okay, yeah, that's the next line. You're right. I'm just looking in that. Good. You're heading in the right direction. But in that line that you just read, what's the word that they use? You were going to say it, Aaron.
The course of human events
It becomes
necessary.
necessary. They claim that it's necessary to separate. What does that mean? Why is that important? Why is that significant?
It means that they're supposed to, they need to separate.
They need to, yeah. No, not just we want to. This is not just a whim. This isn't, we prefer not to be part of the British people anymore. They make the claim right off at the beginning that this is a matter of necessity, right? It's not something even that we, although they are choosing to declare independence, they're claiming that there's some higher reasons that are compelling them to do this, right? It's a matter of necessity according to them.
Yeah,
okay.
They don't explain how Britain is being tyrannical and they need to get like escape.
That's true. That's true. And the long part, the bulk of the Declaration is a long list of what are known as the grievances, right? But we want to get everything we can out of this first paragraph, right? So the first thing Aaron notices is that they're dissolving the political bands as a matter of necessity. Okay, good. What else do you notice in this first paragraph? Anybody?
I kind of find it interesting how they find it so important to give the reasons for the separation.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. And why do they say it's important to give reasons?
Because it's out of a decent respect to the opinions of mankind.
Okay, good. What does that mean? Why do they put that in there? And what does that mean? You're right. They say a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they, notice by the way in the first paragraph, they're the authors of the Declaration, right? Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Roger Sherman and a few others who drafted it, right? But the Congress is saying they're talking about a people in the second person, right? So the first paragraph is in the second person. When a people is compelled by necessity to separate, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So what do you notice about that?
They don't want to be looked down on in history as those people who just rebelled from their mother nation. They want to have a justified reason, and so they want to explain it. They don't want to just be the country that, for some reason, decided to declare war on their mother country.
Now, see, that's interesting, Wyatt. So why do they think that if they just rebelled, and you use the term rebelled, that somehow history would look down on them, and perhaps the rest of the world? Why do you think that?
I think that we tend to have this idea of preserving the existing order, and if you don't give a good reason for why you're going to make an action, then we tend to assume the worst about your motives, especially if we are perhaps the British government and we don't like what you're doing.
Okay, so somebody, I don't know if Daniel or Wyatt, if it was you or Daniel, somebody used the term mother country, I believe, right? We're breaking from the mother country, and that reminds me of, the mother's parents, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Seems to me that children rebel.
Yeah, quite a lot.
Right? And why do children usually rebel against parents? Young children, especially.
Because they feel like it. They're not in a good mood. They want a cookie or they don't want to time out.
They feel like it. Or they don't like what mom and dad have told them, right? Or they want this and they can't have it, so they're going to throw a fit and rebel or do whatever they want to do, right? There's something, when I think of the word rebel, I think of something that's done sort of impulsively, passionately, not with a lot of thought, and it's done more, there's something childish about it in a way, right? So I don't think they want to be viewed as simply rebelling, right? So some Anna just put it has something to do the ultimate hissy fit. That's perfect. That's the term I was looking for, right? We're not just throwing a hissy fit here. We want the rest of the world to know that we believe that there are good reasons for us to separate, right? Not rebel, but separate.
They also mention
Yeah.
almost as if they have a duty to separate, because they talk about the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them to dissolve these bonds. So it's almost as if they didn't, that would be the immoral action, and it would be wrong for them to not dissolve.
Yeah. So thanks, Isaiah. Let's look at that sentence or that clause. By the way, I keep saying sentence. I have to correct myself because that whole opening paragraph is one sentence. It's a really, really long sentence, and it's a complicated sentence, which is why we're taking our time and kind of breaking it down and thinking it through. But back Isaiah, to what you were just pointing to. They talk about they're aiming, they claim that they're separating and assuming among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. So when you hear the word entitle, what do you think of?
They are entitled to be independent. They're not just like not just like, oh, we need to be independent. It's not I want to be independent. It is that we are entitled to our independence, giving a reason to secede.
Okay, so we have a right to independence. They're making the claim we have a right to independence. But back to Isaiah's point, Isaiah, you said that it's more than simply saying we have a right. It's almost as though they're sort of morally. How did you put it? Um, you put it better than I am right now. How did you put it, Isaiah?
Well, I said it's kind of like they have a moral obligation to do it because, John Locke's ideas of the laws of nature and then of the God that the vast majority of them believed in said they should.
Yeah, and by the way, so what is it that entitles them? Just laws, right? I mean, the particular laws, Isaiah, that you're pointing out are right. The laws of nature and of nature's God, right? But laws are laws. Laws don't say, you know, you're entitled to this necessarily. The idea of a law is it tells you you will do this or you will be punished somehow, right? That's the idea of a law. You must do something. So the laws of nature and of nature's God, whatever those are, and Isaiah, you brought Locke up, right? So you've read some John Locke and his understanding of the laws of nature and these things. And I think a lot of Americans understood those things too at the time of the founding, at the time of the revolution. But the laws of nature and of nature's God both entitle them to separate, but also I think you're right, Isaiah. They place a moral obligation on them to separate.
And not only do they place a moral obligation, but they place a religious responsibility too, with the people of America being very religious at that time, saying it's God's law to be able to revolt is very, very strong language at that time.
Sure. Yeah, there are 5 references to God or a divine power in the Declaration of Independence, and the first is nature's God. It's the laws of nature's God, which is interesting, Nathan, since you bring this up. It's a specific notion of God, right? It doesn't rule out a Christian God or the idea of a Christian God.
But it's a
But
little detached from Christianity.
well, yeah, it could be. You're right. But it could include the Christian God. But I think what they're doing here, if I can play with this, and anybody, feel free to jump in, Nathan, on this. What they're focusing on is a certain aspect of God as sort of the God of nature, the creator of nature, in a way, right?
Yeah.
This is getting a little abstract. God is the cause of nature or the world and human beings sort of being the way they are. God is the cause of those things.
And they're kind of saying it is inherent in humanity to be able to have freedom. So it's not the situation; it's a very inherent right.
Yeah.
To something granted by the government.
Yeah, and why is it inherent in human beings to be free? Because, as you were saying, Nathan,
because of nature's laws and nature's God.
yeah,
Religious and philosophical idea.
when you look around at the way the world is, the way nature is, including human nature, and again, this sentence implies that the authors of the Declaration and Americans who agree with this at the time, this implies that they believed God made human beings the way they are for a reason, right? That okay, so I'm being too abstract. Let me try another tack really quick. If you said human beings are inherently free by nature, what I think the Declaration is implying is that means God has made them in such a way that He wants them to be free. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm being clear.
That's pretty much what it's saying.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So the laws of nature entitle us to be free, but right. So we have the right to be free from these laws of nature and of nature's God, but there's also that moral component which suggests that because we are capable of being capable of being free by nature, we have an obligation to try to be free by nature, and not just free in an abstract sense, right? But free in the real sense, free in the way we live, free in the way we live our lives, um, and these sorts of things. So good. So see how this is really good. We're pulling things we're slowing down, we're taking our time with this really complicated sentence, and we're pulling some really interesting thoughts out of it. What else do we notice in that first paragraph? Anything else?
I can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that what I would notice is that it says when in the course of human events. That's all of history, and then it says laws of nature and nature's God. That doesn't just apply to that one part of history. That applies to all of history and even going forward. So a lot of people would say the Declaration of Independence doesn't have meaning today. Today we've progressed away from the ideas here, but here it says laws of nature and nature's God. When in the course of human events, these are historical ideas that not only apply, they said it becomes necessary for one people, so that it doesn't just apply to America, but they're saying this applies to all of humanity throughout all of history.
I think so, Daniel. This is an interesting connection you're making between the laws of nature and of nature's God, which I do think the Americans at the time of the Revolution, especially the people we call founders, the founders believed were eternal and unchanging, right? But you're connecting those eternal laws of nature to the course of human events, which is history. That's an interesting connection. And from that, you are concluding or inferring that that means that these laws of nature and of nature's God apply not just to Americans at this moment in history, but to all mankind at some point in the future of history. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
What is there any other evidence in this paragraph to back that up? I think there is.
Let's see. It says um, to assume among the powers of the earth. But I think the main thing is in the next paragraph when it says all men are
Ah,
created equal.
okay, good. So good. We're heading in the right direction. So the other thing I was thinking of, Daniel, is the that decent respect for the opinions of mankind, right? Requires that they should declare the causes. I think there are two reasons why they think they should declare their causes. One is the reason that Wyatt and others were mentioning earlier. We don't want to be viewed by others, either now or in the future, as whiny little rebels throwing a hissy fit, as Anna put it. But I think there's also a concern for the future of mankind here. If we declare the reasons we believe it's necessary to do so to the rest of humanity, it's possible that we may open their eyes to the laws of nature and of nature's God that apply to not just Americans, but to all human beings in all places at all times. So by declaring the causes, it's possible that we are opening the eyes of humanity. To borrow a line from a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote, we are the Declaration is meant to be a signal to the rest of the world for other human beings around the world to burst the chains, right, that have bound them, and you know, the sort of chains of oppression. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, right? It's meant to be a signal to the rest of the world. And so I'm seeing a lot of people typing in the chat. That's great. Rachel mentioned South American colonies, or colonies in South America. Absolutely. At the time, not shortly after the American Revolution, I don't think it's an accident that a lot of countries in Latin America begin to rise up against their colonial overlords and masters, right? Especially the Spanish, but others. And they were inspired by the example of the United States in their Declaration of Independence, which is why you can find in almost every South American country, sorry, Latin American country, in almost every one that hasn't been taken over by communists, you can still find statues of Americans like Thomas Jefferson and other statesmen like Henry Clay and others. So, good, great thought, Daniel. So you're pointing us to the second paragraph, though. What are those what we call principles? What are those principles? Which, anybody speak Latin? Anybody know any Latin principles? So it comes from a Latin word.
I think it's principia.
Yeah,
All
which
right.
means, well, that's, yeah. What does that mean?
Like principles or
Yeah,
principle.
the English word principles. Yeah, Madison types beginning. Perfect. Yeah, it means first thing, right? A principle is a first thing. Like a prince is the first citizen of a society, of a political society. So principles are first things. And it seems to me these are the things, we go in the second paragraph, these are the things that, because we believe them to be true, those are the things that compel us, right? Not just entitle us to our separation, but really add that sort of moral obligation somebody was saying earlier to our separation. So anybody want to read second paragraph?
I'll read.
Please go right ahead.
Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
Can we pause there?
Yeah.
Good, thank you very much. We'll pause there because the next, there are 5 principles in this paragraph, and we just laid out 4 of them. The 5th one is really, really long, right? So let's thank you. Good job. Let's see if there. What do you all notice in those couple of sentences there that Rachel?
So,
Eugene?
yes. So, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you and see you just fine. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
So it talks about that they are endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights, i.e., this is linking back to the first paragraph, talking about the laws of nature. So it's saying that life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all of those are naturally given to them. Every man is born with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by
Right.
their Creator.
And the language is all men, right? Which everybody at the time that this was written understood is the term that embraces all of humanity, right? Grammatically. So good. So Eugene, you notice the rights in particular that with which all men are endowed, which is an interesting word, right? What does endowed mean?
Means to be given a right.
Yeah. Granted, something's granted, right, to you, which is interesting. Because, by the way, so some of you have studied European history up to this point. In typical European societies, England even, for example, throughout most of its history, if you had any rights, who endowed you with those rights?
The Lord or the king. Or...
Right. Yeah. The king, whoever was ruling, right? So, anybody read the English Bill of Rights? For example, the English Bill of Rights that came out of the Glorious Revolution, 1688. Yeah, Aaron has. So, or even the Magna Carta. You can go all the way back to Magna Carta. Those are documents that demand rights for certain English subjects, but who are they demanding those rights from? The king. It's always from the king, right? And the king, it's interesting if you think about it, the king, when you were given certain rights or privileges, the idea was the king entitled you to those things. So even if you just take that term literally, for example, right? If you were given special privileges and made a knight or a duke or a baron or whatever it might be, you were given a title. And therefore you were entitled, which brought along with it certain rights and privileges and so on and so forth. But the Declaration is a radically new, revolutionary statement. It is saying we no longer believe that if human beings have rights, that they come from the king. Where do they come from? We've already said it. They're given those things by the Creator, right? Which is somebody said nicely. That's a tie back to that first paragraph with the idea of nature's God. Good.
And I think
Go ahead, please.
I think this is the key point in the Declaration of Independence is when it says all men are created equal. Everything in the rest of the Declaration of Independence and even in the Constitution flows from this section of the Declaration of Independence, because if all men are created equal, if that's a groundbreaking statement. Today it's taken for granted, but throughout most of human history that was not taken for granted. And that's revolutionary, because once you say that all men are created equal, then that means that they do have the rights, that they're endowed by their Creator, and everyone has the rights, not just the king. God gives everyone those rights, and if you establish that, then you have the consent of the governed. The king can't just decide, I'm going to rule, because he doesn't have all the rights. Now everyone has the rights, and because of that, from the consent of the governed, you get the separation of powers, and you now have the government being made by the consent of the people, but the people aren't actually in the government, and that's how the entire Constitution is formed, from that one principle that all men are created equal.
Yeah, you threw a lot out there, Daniel. That was very thoughtful. I saw a lot of people chatting similar ideas. Somebody chatted the idea that what they notice in the language of the Declaration of Independence is they substitute the word government for king, right? So, but government is more than just the king. Somebody chatted that, earlier. I think that's a really good point. So our idea of what government should do and what distinguishes good government from bad government, or shall I say just from unjust government, is whether it lives up and fulfills those other principles that you're pointing to, Daniel, beginning with the fundamental principle. The very first one is the claim, and the revolution. It's radical. It's a radical claim. All men are created equal. I mean, the British heard that and they just laughed. They thought, these guys are crazy. That's nuts. Even Edmund Burke, for example. Some of you may know Edmund Burke, a prominent British parliamentarian at the time, who was rather sympathetic, if you will, to the American cause, or at least the American complaints about abuses by the king. He even thought that was crazy. All men are created equal. I don't see it. Where do we see all men? I don't see people being born equal. I see people who are different. I see by nature people who are very different in terms of talents and abilities and faculties and intelligence and strength and all of these other things. But the Declaration says in some fundamentally important way, all men are created equal. And that's the first thing.
It separates the idea of utilitarianism, what a man can do, from what a man is worth.
So Nathan, if I can play with this for a second, that's an interesting point. Even somebody, let's say you've got, I'm trying to think of an example here. You take the smartest man. I don't know who's the smartest man in the world. I don't know.
If you have like Albert Einstein, and then like
Albert Einstein, yeah. Okay.
Like guy who saw on the street.
The guy was extremely smart, yeah.
Yeah, but then you can say that even though Albert Einstein is smarter, and that guy just found the street, he isn't that smart. they're still equal. Like because one guy he's less smart doesn't mean that he's a lesser being.
He still has rights, right, Aaron?
Yeah, but then I was thinking about this compared to slavery because there are a whole bunch of documents saying like to the black people they are black and they have like coarse hair and they're like not as smart. And so since they're like not as smart or like not human beings and they can be enslaved. Because that goes against what the
Yeah.
Declaration of Independence. It says that all men are created equal.
Yeah, see, that's the big problem, of course, Aaron, right? Is the problem of slavery. So how do we do this? Um, does the Declaration of Independence say all men are equal? It
Yeah,
does.
it
No, it
does.
does. Does it? It says all men are equal.
Hmm. It does.
Where?
All men are created equal.
No,
That's,
listen. Yeah, but listen to what I'm saying. Does it say all men are equal? Let
I
me do it
think
in.
that's what it says.
They're all
No,
created equal, but
it,
that doesn't mean that
it
they're all
only
equal.
it only says they're created equal, but that does not mean
Okay.
they'll end up.
Every man has talents, but they have to decide what to do with them.
Okay. So I'll say it again. Maybe I'm putting the emphasis on the wrong word. If I say all men are equal, what I mean by that is if you look around, even at the time of the founding, and you look around um, among the European people of European descent, and you look at African Americans and slaves, and the thing we notice is they are not equal, right? Even among people of European descent, there are some who are wealthier than others, and there are poor, and there are some who are well educated, and some who can't even vote. Right? By the way, there are um, in most states women couldn't vote. Um, in some states, white males who had a certain amount of property could vote. In some states, African Americans could vote, but not in most. So when you look around at the way things actually were at the time, you have to say all men are not actually equal, right? They're not actually equal.
They are born with opportunities.
Ah, who said that?
Madison.
Madison. Okay, I can't see you. I can hear you, but so what does that mean? I think that's a big distinction and an important distinction. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's sort of like the decisions that they make in their life that make them different, but they're all born with the equal opportunity.
Okay.
If you get
But
I think you're onto something.
can I just say though that like African Americans and slaves though they don't have the chances to be equal.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly what Nathan Estrick said in the chat.
That's absolutely right. They do not have the opportunities, and that's the way it actually is, right? At that time, they did not have the opportunities. The vast majority of them are slaves, right? And because of the way political and social conditions actually are at the time, they are not given the freedom. Opportunity is just another word for freedom in a certain way, right? The
I
freedom
think it could be
to make
described more as all men are given the same abilities to create opportunities for themselves, although they are not born into the same situations.
so by abilities, Eugene, what do you mean? Abilities.
I mean, like, every man is born with these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Those are the fundamental state of being mankind.
Okay.
So every man is born with these, and they have the right to create whatever they want with these rights.
Yeah, that's liberty, right? Liberty. I mean, life is the most obvious, right? You have the right to preserve yourself, but liberty means doing something with yourself, including your rights, and doing that is doing something with your rights, with your potentials, with your abilities, right? Is usually what we think of as pursuing happiness, right? So let me backtrack a little bit. This is really interesting. At the time that this is written, not everybody actually enjoys those natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They don't actually have the opportunity or freedom to act on their abilities. Is that how you put it, Eugene? Right? That they are given by nature.
Yeah, yeah.
So but the Declaration says all men are created equal because they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it seems to me there are at least two ways at least two ways we can think about the importance of this paragraph here, right? We can say, well, these guys are just lying, or they're just talking about white men, so on. You guys have heard perhaps some of these arguments, but there's another way you can read this. You can read it as though as saying, excuse me, I'll try to be clear here for a second. You can read that line that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. You can read that as an admission, if you will, admission that the society that they lived in at that time is not actually living up to the things that they claim are true and therefore ought to be true or ought to be in place in society.
I'd say also,
Please, yeah, go ahead.
it's really interesting if you look at the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, because there was a paragraph put in there that was later taken out, of the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, and that paragraph describes it's the last complaint that they have against the king, and it says he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who have never defended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. And it goes on to talk about how the king is putting the people in slavery, and it basically blames the king for putting slavery in the American society. And that was taken out of the Declaration of Independence, likely because of the worries that the worries that the other people at the convention had, many of whom were actually slave owners. But if that had stayed in the Declaration of Independence, it might have changed American government. And it's interesting to see that Jefferson, a slave owner, wrote that part into the Declaration, and then
Okay,
it was
so
later
Daniel,
deleted.
Daniel, there's a lot there. You're very thoughtful, and I'm not that quick. I need to go back a little bit and think that through. So I'm going to ask you to clarify a few things. One, what does he call these people from a distant land? You've got it in front of you, right? What does he
Yeah,
call them?
he calls them captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, and
Right,
he
but
says
before that,
the persons of a distant people who never offended him.
he calls them persons.
Yes, persons.
Jefferson wrote that in his draft, and he calls them persons.
Hmm.
Keep reading. What else does he call them? What else does he describe them as?
He says captivating, and after that he says captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable what?
Keep going, please.
Or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men
There you
should
go.
be bought and sold. Yeah,
Right. Calls them men.
men. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the evidence that I think is easily pulls the rug out from under this claim that the word men in the Declaration only applies to white males. Doesn't he also mention women and children in that paragraph somewhere?
Let's see.
Yep.
Yes, I think he does. He has prostituted his negative for
Yeah.
suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain his commerce.
Yeah.
And it says murdering. Let's see. I don't see children.
Okay. I might be thinking of another paragraph, but here's the point. This is good. I'm glad you brought this up. Why was that taken out? You mentioned one reason, Daniel.
I think the reason we don't know, of course,
We do know.
what the founders like. We don't. Do we know why they took that
We
out?
do know. Yeah, because Thomas Jefferson was in Congress, of course, when this was written, and he kept notes of the debates that took place in Congress, and he kept notes of the debates over the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson says it was taken out at the request of gentlemen from the southern states and certain gentlemen of the northern states because they all felt guilty about the existence of slavery. So slavery existed predominantly in the southern states. By the way, when the Declaration of Independence was written, where was slavery legal? How many states?
In all of them, right?
Yep, you got it. See, so we think today it was, we think of the over time it becomes localized in the South, but at the time of the Declaration of Independence being written, there was slavery in every state. Pennsylvania did away with slaves shortly after this. They were, I think, the first to do away with it. But Jefferson says it was done away with at the request of certain gentlemen from the southern states in Congress, and he suggests that they had sort of feelings of guilt about the existence of slavery. But then there were people in the North, because that's where most of the slaves came in to the states, to the colonies originally. They came into ports in the North where they were bought and sold in slave markets. So this was there were feelings of guilt, Jefferson suggests, on the part of both Northern and Southern gentlemen in Congress.
But it's weird because Jefferson himself actually once said that slaves were African people were biologically inferior to white people.
Close. You're close, Eugene. You're close. I know what you're looking at. You read his notes on the state of Virginia, I think is what you're thinking of. What he actually says in the notes in the state of Virginia is somebody in France, I believe, a friend of his from France writes to Jefferson and with a bunch of questions, and he wants to know what African Americans are like, what the slaves are like. And Jefferson he tests a hypothesis, he says, that African Americans are deficient in certain things, including creativity and reasoning. But Jefferson never says that he believes that. He tests the hypothesis and he says, I only hazard that thought sort of abstractly as an experiment. So you're close, Eugene. He never says they are inferior. He thinks through whether or not they are, and he's not sure in when does he write notes? In 1780 something, I believe. He doesn't conclude that they're inferior at that time. But later, Eugene, he does very clearly and firmly come to the conclusion that African Americans are not inferior in the things that make them human beings and therefore entitled to equal natural rights. And he writes in another famous letter to another Frenchman. Jefferson had a lot of friends in France. He says, even though Sir Isaac Newton, somebody mentioned Albert Einstein earlier. In Jefferson's day, Isaac Newton was the smartest guy in the world. Thomas Jefferson says, even though Sir Isaac Newton is by far the smartest, most intelligent man of the age, that does not entitle him to rule other, less intelligent people without their consent. And then Jefferson goes on and explains how that claim that some people had been making, that is, that African American slaves were intellectually inferior, Jefferson says that claim is not valid. But you see the problem here, I'm glad you're raising these points, because what we're back to is this question of why did they write it if it wasn't true? And it wasn't true. Eugene, you're absolutely right, and others that have brought this up. It is absolutely true that the Declaration says all men are created equal, and yet you look around and even Jefferson himself has slaves. So please, yeah, go ahead.
If you're talking about slavery, from what I've heard, it sounds like the founders or framers of the nation, they didn't want to institutionalize and make an institution out of slavery. And also, from what I've also heard, they tried to put in laws later on restricting the slave trade from Africa to America, hoping that it would just die out. Now, obviously, that didn't happen, but yeah, I don't think they wanted slavery. It was just something that was part of America at that time.
Well, part of the problem here is we're in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, right? And what we're trying to do in this document is tell the world we're separating, and here's why. And we're laying out these basic principles about fundamental rights. And again, Rachel read earlier the next couple of lines. We're also laying out fundamental ideas about what good government should look like, right? So as Rachel read earlier, government, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it's the Declaration says the government's government's primary job, it's really its only job, is to secure those natural rights that all men are endowed with by nature, by God, from God by nature. And in doing and exercising its powers to secure those rights, in order for those powers, in order for government to be just, it has to get those powers from the consent of the governed. But Daniel, back to your point, those are really broad ideas about good government. It has to secure your rights and it has to operate on consent. But it doesn't, beyond that, it doesn't lay out a frame of government, right? With law, it's not laying out a constitution of government.
Well, I would say it kind of does lay out a frame of government because it seems like if you get into the uh, the facts that are submitted to the candid world, um, those when he starts laying out the things the king has done to them, the oppressions of the king, that seems to be an outline of the Constitution. Like when it says, uh, Andrew, stop it. Sorry about that. But when it says like the legislature's done this and he's done, it's him, it's the king being an executive, a judicial, and a legislative branch at the same time. And also, it refers to God throughout the Declaration as both a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. So I think the framework of government is laid out in like the list of the king's things. Each of those, that's the Constitution protects against that.
Yes, that's true, but it doesn't lay out a formal separation of powers and enumerating powers and these things. But you're right, Daniel. I think that these statements are in the Declaration are negative statements about abuses by the king that will try to be corrected in the actual Constitution that's written in 1787. You're right. So, but sorry, I got off on a tangent there. I apologize. My point earlier about going back to the slavery question. The question is, how do you get rid of slavery? We have to keep in mind that if slavery is going to be done away with, there is no national government. It has to be done on a state by state basis, right? So I've seen a lot of great texts or chats, sorry, a lot of great things typed into the chat box on this question. And somebody mentioned that a lot of the founders, the people we think of as founders, had slavery. What did they do about slavery? The first, we could spend another 2 hours talking about this, which we don't have time to do. But I'll just say for now that they did what they could do within their particular state. And some states did make movements toward ending slavery, and other states they didn't accomplish as much. So for example, in the state of Virginia, Jefferson and James Madison introduced several laws in the legislature to abolish this importation of slaves into Virginia, make it easier to manumit or free individual slaves. And they introduced those laws and were largely unsuccessful because the rest of Virginia wasn't ready for those kinds of laws. So it's a very complicated question why they didn't do it. But I'm talking too much. But I guess my larger point is, it seems to me that despite that fact, which is not a good thing, right? Nobody's saying that it's good that they had slaves, or nobody's trying to defend the fact that they had slaves. The fact that they made the claim that all men are created equal, it holds up an idea somehow. It holds up an idea that potentially could work its way into the minds of Americans. And over time, they might realize that the society that they actually live in does not measure up to that claim in the Declaration of Independence. In other words, it's possible that line, all men are created equal, could become a standard that over time in the future, excuse me, in the course of human events, we try to work toward. So it might take time, but I think a lot of them did believe that the goal in the future is to move more and more toward actually living up to that claim that all men are created equal. And I think you saw a lot of movement toward that claim in some of the northern states. And I think you see by the 1810s and 1820s a movement backwards in a way, away from that claim that all men are created equal in certain southern states. And so you now have a country that's moving in two different directions with regard to that claim, all men are created equal. And once you get a country that's divided over that and moving in two different directions, you might say, well, it's almost inevitable that as Abraham Lincoln will say later, that the war came, right? So good.
And I would
Please.
also add, you talked about the trajectory since we've been found. I think we've been struggling to try to create a society where all men are created equal, and
Sure.
we were able to abolish slavery, but there was still racism in the southern states and even in some of the northern states. And then you have women didn't have the right to vote and couldn't own land. There were a lot of we had to get over that hurdle, and now even today there are we're killing a lot of people before they're even born, and it's just we're still striving, and we still have a long way to go, but over time I think we have gotten slightly better, and we're still working towards all men are created equal. That still
Yeah,
should be our goal.
that's interesting, and I might agree with you, I might not. That's not important. But the point is, I think it's because they made that claim in the Declaration. Because they made that claim, we believe as a people that equality is important and liberty is important, right? Equality and liberty for all is important.
That's how they
And
built like our
whether we've made progress or not, the point is that becomes a goal for us to aim at, and that's why we are still today, partly, I think, always working toward that. I'm sorry, Aaron, did you want to jump in? Aaron, go ahead.
So I think that's why they built our entire state on like we believe in liberty and freedom because it just this one statement exists. Uh, we all men are created equal, and then for that, then the whole like the entire United States was built on that statement.
It became part of what Thomas Jefferson calls the American mind, and once that becomes the thing that we say is most true to us, which is just another way of saying most important to us, then it's not going to be it's not an accident, I think, that in one sense our 200 some years of history since the Declaration of Independence has been our country moving higher or moving more and more toward fulfilling that idea
Yeah,
that all men are created equal.
like every year before the first we had slavery, and then we got rid of slavery. Now we have racism, and every year we're getting closer and closer to removing racism.
Yeah. Well, that becomes the goal. I mean, right? That becomes really, in many ways, the very essence of who we are as a people. That's why it's important to note that in the first paragraph, as I mentioned, we're talking about a people in the second person, right? They, a people. It's important to notice the very first word of the second paragraph is first person, right? We. We believe these five things, and the very first thing is all men are created equal. I don't think that's an accident, right? We believe all men are created equal. We believe that they're endowed by their creator with these certain rights, unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That means there are more not included in the Declaration or listed. We believe that the job of government is to secure those rights, operating on the consent of the governed. And the fifth thing that we didn't get to is what happens when government doesn't either secure our rights, or what happens when government doesn't operate on consent. Nathan says abolish it. The Declaration gives you two alternatives. You don't have to abolish it. You can alter it.
Yeah,
Right?
basically, the government supports rights, and if they don't do this, and people have one of their rights is they can change it if they want to.
Sure. Yeah, the Declaration, we should read this. Anybody want to read? We only have about 3 minutes left. Let's read that last couple of lines of that last paragraph. Anybody want to read, starting with that whenever?
I'll read.
Go ahead, please.
So this is just the second paragraph.
That whenever any form?
Whenever any form.
It's in the second paragraph, about 5 lines down.
Sorry. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends. It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Okay, can we pause, Aaron, for a second? Good. So the Declaration says when government doesn't do its job, securing your rights, either it violates your rights or it actually doesn't do things necessary to secure your rights. It is the right of the people to do two things. And notice the Declaration says alter first. That's your first alternative. But if you can't alter it, change it, right? Change your laws, change your constitution. Then maybe you do have to abolish it. But when should you abolish it? And Aaron, keep reading if you don't mind.
Sure, okay, so prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes.
Okay, good. So let's pause there for a second. See, right? So right after the Declaration says people have a right to alter or abolish, they back up and they say, but be careful, right? Prudence says, anybody know the word prudence? What's prudence mean? It's an old word we don't use very much anymore, but I like it. Common sense, rational thought, caution and wisdom, these are all good. Yeah, right? It just means good judgment, right? Exercising good judgment means don't rush into things. Yeah, Eugene, street sense. Yeah, right, common sense, right? Common sense says, oh man, they raised my taxes this year by 5 cents. Maybe we want a revolution. Maybe that's not common sense, right? But Jefferson goes on. I'll just finish for the sake of time here because we're running out of time. But the Declaration says, but when it becomes clear that government is corrupt, that is, that it's not securing your rights or it's abusing your rights, then it's not only your right, it's your duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for your future security. So kind of as a last resort, but you do have the right. So we've sort of run out of time here. This has been really interesting. Other thoughts, last thoughts, or questions or observations? We could keep going, I'm sure, for a few more hours. And if we were actually in a college course right now, we would keep going. But
I think it's interesting how big happiness is in the Declaration. Like it's
interesting. Who said that? I'm sorry.
Nathan.
Who is this?
Nathan.
Nathan. Hi. So you're not showing up on my screen for some reason. Yeah, happiness is important, right?
I think one of the interesting things is why is it happiness rather than property, which is the typical John Locke statement.
Yeah, great question.
Property.
Yeah, and we do know why Jefferson didn't use the word property. It was because he actually believed that if he put we are endowed with the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. He believed that that would be used as an argument in defense of owning property and slaves.
Right.
So he took property out and put the pursuit of happiness in there. Yeah,
also,
good point.
I think one of the reasons was because a lot of colonists didn't own that much property, so pursuit of happiness appealed a lot more to them.
That's a great point. Great point. Was that Peter?
Yeah.
Yep, that's a great point.
Can I just
please
also say, slaves were also thought as property during that time. So.
That's right. That's right. Which again is a reason why Jefferson left that word out of the Declaration, because he was actually afraid that at some point in the future people would say, look, we're endowed with the natural right to own slaves, because the word property's in there.
The idea of happiness kind of flies in the face of what was going on in Britain, where even the freemen who had property, they had liberty, they still really couldn't do very much beyond live in your own little area. They were just people the lords were put much higher, even if they were free.
See, so Nathan, I'm sorry I kept interrupting. I didn't mean to, but I think this is a good point to end on, perhaps, because um, what the Declaration implies is that, look, the purpose of government is not just to keep you alive. You don't simply want a government that preserves you, and yet, so you're preserved, but you still live a miserable, unhappy life, right? I mean, we want something more out of life. And liberty, freedom, is that thing that if we're given the opportunity to pursue it and enjoy it and do things with our talents and abilities, as Eugene and others were saying earlier, we can improve our lives. We can make ourselves happy in a certain way, right? We can make our lives, for example, we can why do most people work hard in their life? Why do most people want to be successful in life? I think most people, Aaron says, to be happy. Absolutely. And for me, it was,
Well, it makes them,
go ahead, please.
it makes them feel fulfilled. It's not so much happiness, because happiness is basically the pursuit of good luck, and who knows where luck will take you.
Yeah.
So it's more of being fulfilled more than anything else.
Sure. Right. You want to feel as though your talents have been put to good use and you've proven yourself to be capable of doing something good and important. And for a lot of people, myself included, you know, um, a lot of people want to be successful in life, but what makes them happiest is that their success leads to a better life for their children and their grandchildren, right? Their families. That makes a lot of people happy, right? That they can support their families and not just support them, but provide opportunities for their children to live a better life than they did. I'm thinking of my own father right now, who was a very good man, and we grew up and didn't have a lot of money, but he worked really hard to make life good for us, so that his kids could go on to college and do something with themselves. But at any rate, so you see how if what we do with our courses, and we'll continue to do these in our other conversations, we take an important document and we draw things out of it to get a deeper sense of things. And I think that in many ways, these principles in the Declaration do reveal something very important about the character of American society, even to this day. So I thank you very much for an interesting, lively conversation. Hope you come back. Ben, what's the next one? Do we know? If Ben's still there, I'm not sure if Ben's even there.
Yeah, the next one we'll be doing the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom on October 8th. And Dr. Stevens will be leading us that night.
Excellent.
A silent partner this evening.
Sorry.
I was here the whole time paying attention to this wonderful conversation.
So the Statute for Religious Liberty, interesting. Another document by Thomas Jefferson, next time led by Professor Stevens. So hope you all come back, and I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.